Thank you all for joining. I wanted to talk about some pods questions. I think there's a lot of questions about pods and we don't have the answers to them, and that's fine. But I think there are some questions about pods that we do really need to have answers for, or at least know what the questions are that we're trying to answer. And that way, hopefully at the end of this call, we'll have the question that we need to have answered, and we'll have a DRI for who needs to answer that. Irvi and I were talking, and I think both of us have a good understanding of like what questions that we have. But I have to admit that I have done a poor job in the agenda of kind of trying to articulate that, but I think it boils down to two, so I'm going to kind of get started. So I did watch the pods direction workspace sync, and I watched the CEO pod sync. The CEO pod sync, I think, is what is prompting me to use the word blockers. I think that the direction, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the direction you all are going in is like to show value, figure out what the MVC is. I'm completely supportive of that. I'm not trying to block that at all. But if you all do that in Q1, set an MVC and start going down this path, then I think there are some things that might not be reversible, like the organization concept or some of the isolation issues. So my first question is on the organization concept. And this is just trying to get an answer around if this concept is moving forward and how it's moving forward, especially when it comes to workspace. So I'll leave it at that, but I can probably explain more.
I think the first question, just for terminology, is the Workspace Group renaming itself and the workspace to use the term organization? Because then we can just talk about organizations and what that may potentially mean, but treat them as the same thing and talk about that. That's maybe, I haven't followed up on that.
Yeah, so Workspace Group is definitely getting renamed to organization. And that's in the works. I mean, it's pending approval from David, but it's almost, we have received some feedback around, what the name should be. And I think it's pretty final that we'll be calling it organization.
Okay, because then we can just talk about organizations for the rest of the call, and I don't need to use organization slash workspace, because we just sort of assume they're going to end up being the same thing, but we don't quite know yet what that means, and pods has maybe different opinions to what it should be compared to what you have, but just to make sure I use the correct terms. Thank you. So and Camille can correct me, and Barry, right? We as group pods are interested in shipping value and iterating, and we've actually thought about how we can do this, and I've linked that at the bottom of the agenda, because there are probably different paths that we can take, one of which will have to figure out this concept of organizations. And I'll put on my product hat, not my engineering hat, right? And I think from my product perspective, the problem that pods introduces is a problem of increased isolation, where if things live on different pods and they lived on one thing beforehand, interacting between those becomes difficult, right? That is the problem at hand. And organizations, as proposed by us, would hopefully solve this, right? With the notion that right now, if customers have multiple top-level namespaces, they expect that they can interact between them, right? I've explained that in some examples like GitLab-com and GitLab-org. So we realize as pods that isolation between those top-level namespaces for one customer when they have many is something that we need to solve for. And so a proposal that we've made is to say, well, let's wrap them into an organization concept. I think that is pretty much as far as we've come. And then there is quite a bit of context, I think, between like how to maybe get to that place. And this is where it gets complicated and maybe more engineering focused, right? As in, should we create a new entity like in the database that's called organization, do that? Or will we turn a top level namespace into an organization and migrate through that? I have no answer to this. And I know Camille is more tuned into this and Barry to a certain extent, but that is where we are coming from. But
I would probably like describe it easier. Like I would say, think about the organization as your small on-premise installation within GitLab to behave exactly as on-premise. I think this is ultimately our proposal, that like from your perspective as a user, you simply create organization and you get on-premise like experience as you would be running that locally, but within GitLab.com. I think this is the simplest explanation of the pods.
I think that's true. That's
Okay,
our
so
vision.
I have a question then on that point. Basically, what it means is you're solving for how does organizations stay contained within one entity or container, whatever we are going to call it. Are we going to call it organization or pods? Maybe that's for later. But my question is that why wouldn't it be in a normal project group team structure? Why wouldn't they be? I mean, it seems like a very obvious requirement from a client or a customer that if I have multiple projects that we are running, we ultimately want to be able to isolate one thing completely, maybe because it's too early for people to share on that, or I don't know, for whatever reasons, right? But it seems like a very obvious requirement that any kind of file folder structure that we come up with, ultimately, I don't want to call it namespace and I don't want to call it pods, but whatever we come up with, it has to solve for that. So I guess in other words, I'm asking like, what prompted this? Because it seems very obvious.
So I don't want to say if this is obvious or not, right? I think and I think this is another thing that I would like to be clear on. I never really want to talk about pods with customers. Pods is an architecture, right? It's a thing that underlies our ability to scale. Ideally, like we don't ever have to really explain this, right? But it comes with certain constraints. So Urvi, I think you're partially correct. I think that I think that requirement is one that exists. Right now, this is not how GitLab.com necessarily is structured, and we have many features that cross boundaries between groups or projects. If they're public, you all, I think Michelle and Gosia, much more about this, right? There's a lot of complexity in our permission models and all of those kinds of things, which is what you're actively working on, right? But in simplistic terms, I think what Camille said is right. The desire is to be able to say, this is everything that belongs to an organization, similar to a self-managed instance, and it can live on a single pod. And when we do this, it will break a lot of things. That we know that already. Essentially, almost everything.
Right? And so over half of the GitLab.
Yeah. And so the question is, I think, what we should do to make that more acceptable, right? And to a certain extent, that has impacts on the user experience, because something that used to work will maybe no longer work. And that requires an explanation, right? For users, that is not, well, it's pods, right? And so our thinking is, if you have an organization and the organization is called GitLab, and GitLab is a private organization, the user expectation may be that everything stays within that organization. And if that's true, pods is not a problem. If you cross boundaries, it becomes problematic. How we get there, that's an open question we have to figure out, right? And I think there's some good thoughts on the migration path, but that's the desire. That is also one use case specifically for organizations that want to remain isolated, not so much for open source workflows, right, which are different. And I think this is something for us also to consider, where this model of working may work very well for, and that's an assumption, for customers that have closed source operations that want to not interact with other folks on GitLab.com, and they're happily isolated from everybody else. We know that this is the case for customers in highly regulated large industries, which is why we have dedicated, right? Which is essentially the same user experience, but completely isolated at the infrastructure level. But the assumption is that for many paying customers on GitLab.com, that would also be acceptable, but it is different from now. Right? Think about how you can mention everybody at GitLab. If I type @berry, I get 17 berries, and that would change. That's just only one example of it.
I have some follow-ups. The first follow-up is twice you've described a workspace to me. When Camille just did it, and Fabian, you did it too. You've described that an organization acts like a workspace, the way that we called it. So I'm inclined to think that they are the same. And
yeah,
then
we've been going in like moderate circles and ovals around that for some time. I agree, but I still personally am not 100% sure what a workspace would constitute that isn't an organization, and now a workspace becomes an organization. So they may just be exactly the same thing at the end, at which point it's maybe not as problematic, right? But I think the desire that was expressed to me in some calls is that we may want to have customers with many workspaces, and we expect them to interact between those workspaces. That does not go well with pods, right? And I think this is where maybe the tension comes in. If you say, well, what you're describing is the same as a workspace, and a single workspace is a single organization, then that's fine. My assumption is, though, that those things should by default not actually interact with each other, only in some circumstances and in controlled cases. And I think that is maybe different, maybe.
I think we'll get into that in a minute. I think that applies more to a user namespace, right? Like as a user, I'm a contractor with organization A, B, C, and D, and now I have to figure out if I need 5 different usernames for all of these organizations, or but my second follow-up on this was, it sounds like what we're trying to accomplish with pods is going to break things, and our solution to it is going to be organization rather than organization being put to the forefront. So organization seems like a concept that was created to solve a problem rather than it is the solution to the problem. Pods is the solution, but not organization. Right.
So pods is a solution, we think, to our scalability and reliability concerns, and being able to offer maybe better SLAs at some point. Pods comes with problems, one of which is these harder boundaries, right? And that creates issues in the user experience. One way to address it, we thought, was an organization, which may also be a workspace. So that's that. And that's why we reached out, right? Because ultimately, this is something to be understood and to be collaborated on, in my view, because you know a lot more about the intricacies of GitLab's data model in that area, but it does create questions and work and constraints under which you operate when you envision this in a pod world, right? And that's, I think, what we've intended to highlight. And then people come, and I think Mike Nichols phrased this well, and then people say, like, well, how is all of this going to work? And what we can do, or I can do, and Camille can do better than me, is say, like, well, maybe it can work in this way or that way, right? But I'm not the expert on figuring that out. But we're doing something potentially that will impact you. So we want to make sure that that's understood. And
I mean, like, also, like, we started documenting things that were interesting to us, let's say forks, because this is something that pops up pretty often, like how we gonna deal with the forking model. And there's it's not a topic that is impossible to solve. It's not that pods break forking, it's just it's gonna have to work slightly differently. And like I documented 3 different ways how forking could work in the new model. Everyone with slightly different fundamental design, but it's also like each of these design, in case of some enterprises, actually makes sense what we are doing today. Because I think like there is like a lot of comments popping up about agency type of the interaction, and technically pods as like a forcing function of isolation can actually make it a better experience, because providing more isolation and better control on how actually like the source is being distributed across the system. So I think like at least how I see that is like it's not a black and white. It's not like pods break everything. It's actually in a lot of cases like it's a forcing function to reconsider how we've been doing stuff, and it's not what we've been doing today. It's not by default better than what is proposed. I think like the pods and like the problem and isolation kind of shows that there is like a bunch of stuff that we can do better, that it's like because of the how we run project, like which is mostly like for the customer paying businesses, is probably better than what we are doing today. But I think this is more like the trying to understand each of these individual topics. Like you can look at my take on the forking model, and there's like 3 different proposals, and we have examples of the company using forking model extensively. And I would be not surprised that these companies would really want to control all forks where they are kind of can live, and kind of force that forks can only be created within organization, but never outside of the organization. It may be it's different workflow to the open source, which you may want to copy into your personal stuff. But I think that the answer to that is not like ultimate to what we have today. So sorry for this lengthy, but I think like the pods is more like a forcing function to reconsider what we are doing stuff with the isolation. And there's like all of these things can be solved. It's just they would have to be slightly rethink what we want to achieve.
Yeah, the more and more I hear about the concept that you're trying to explore, it seems to me like it's a use case for organization.
Yes.
Right? But it is not separate from organization. It definitely falls under organization. So what I'm, say for example, there is one use case where you have multiple projects going on and you have contractors working on them and you need to share those projects, right? That's one use case. And second use case is that you are working in a highly regulated environment and you cannot share anything. And in those circumstances, if your resources grow to a very large extent, then the better experience that we can provide you with in terms of search and all of the other things is by isolating everything. Not just your projects and workspace, but all the underlying resources, right? So that's how I understand it. And to me, it is like we should address this use case in organization rather than fork off a completely new thing.
I'm not entirely sure if I understood you correctly. I think generally, yes. If you imagine sort of a spectrum of isolation, GitLab.com right now is completely shared. GitLab dedicated is completely isolated. Pods sort of falls a little bit in the middle because you would have several organizations on a single pod, but then pods are largely isolated from each other. So it's sort of a spectrum, right? And the problem that we're really trying to address is that we know that we won't be able to scale GitLab.com forever. Right? At some point, we will run out of scalability headroom with what we have right now, and that's the underlying consideration for even thinking about this architecture. We did CI decomposition. We bought us time. That's the thing we need to solve.
Okay, I understand now. So what you're saying is that this is an architectural limitation of GitLab.com that we need to consider while if I were to make an assumption that this use case can be accommodated in organization, I'm making a assumption that there is no limitation on GitLab.com.
Mm-hmm. So we are like essentially Pods is in the business of overcoming scalability and reliability concerns, but the architecture that we're proposing, like Camille said, may actually be a positive forcing function in some respects, but also will have impact on our user experience in others, and that we don't know yet, and we don't have all the answers. But one of the areas that's definitely impacted is going to be your group, right? And that's why we know that this is a big concern that we raised, that we need a solution for. So that's how that happened.
Okay, so then let me ask you one more question, and I'll not have the call. So I understand then that, why. So to take a step back, we are talking about 3 different architectures here, right? One is GitLab.com, another is GitLab dedicated, and then there is GitLab pods. Are you saying that in GitLab pods, there won't be any groups and projects? Maybe this is a hypothesis, right? Like you haven't figured it all out, I understand that. But what does that pods even look like? It will definitely have some kind of a structure, right? What does that structure look like? Is it going to follow the same thing that organization does on GitLab.com, or is it completely different?
I'll encourage you to to look at the blueprint that was not linked, I think, from the category page, but on a high level, it would look like something like this, right? Where you have a pod 0, which is GitLab.com, and then many pods, which are essentially instances of GitLab with all of the infrastructure component and some shared cluster metadata, right? And then what would happen is you would be able to have something like this here, right? Where this is now maybe outdated slightly, right? On a pod, you would have several organizations, right? Or top-level namespaces, or whatever we end up doing here. But those things, will be isolated from each other and won't share a lot between pods. There's a network boundary between those things, right?
I mean, like, it's not impossible to share data. It's gonna be hard. So it would kind of like, you would have to build that specifically. For example, if you would want to share like a fork between pod 1 and pod 10, it would have to go through a GraphQL API. It would not be like going through database as it's going today. So there's like technical limitations, like technical complexity, how you use that data from other stuff. So it's in the category of hard. It's not impossible. It's hard to share data.
Yeah, and so sorry, Michelle.
Well, we're running out of time, and I want to close this one out. But it's as we talk about this and what an organization looks like and how it fits within a pod. Like in this conversation, what I would recommend is that a workspace is an organization. The Workspace Group or managed organization or whatever can collaborate with you all on what that looks like and how that works within a pod. But even just based on like Irvi's summary earlier, it sounds like this is just a use case for this group, for the Workspace Group.
Yeah.
The names here are just a mess, but
it is hard. Yeah.
Yes, let's stop using Workspace at all. Let's just use our organization. Do not use Workspace. It's confusing right now what we are talking about.
Well, when the name change goes through, right? Because we already changed it once in the last week, but Gosha's team, I would expect, would be the DRI for what this looks like, how it fits within a pod, and how it works within you all's architectural blueprint.
Yes. So I think I would like to sum this up, and this is the last point on thank you, on how we want to proceed going forward, because there is, I think, as you've all noted, a desire to move forward, right? We've laid out a couple of proposals, or Camille has, so all the credit to him. One of them is about introducing organizations. The other one is to create an actual pod and then give a user on that pod the ability to create a new group or project without introducing an organization at all. It's more about getting a pod up and running, which means decomposing user tables. Like, there's so much work in this, but the iteration that we'll ship out of that is going to be very, very broken. Like, many things are not going to work, but it may already provide some value. And it will certainly, I think, highlight, if you had a pod and you don't have this whole organization concept worked out, how would that even look? I think it would make it a lot more concrete for your group to see what this means, right? So this is, I think, something that's under the group pod control. We can do this, but this is completely doable in parallel to conversations about organizations and how to do it, right? They are independent from each other. The problem that I have, to be very frank, is this is coming in, it's happening. It is potentially disruptive to your roadmap because you have to sort of have that discussion. I think it would be very valuable to collaborate, and figure this out and do it in parallel, because I think the pod train is moving and we will have to figure it out eventually, right? So my desire would be to collaborate very actively and get past all of this naming stuff, get a much more concrete understanding. But I think pods can move forward with sort of creating this pod, decomposing some things, that doesn't really require all of that. But if the parallel track would be nice. But I also agree that group pod can't be responsible for figuring out the implications and user experience for every single broken feature in GitLab, which is why I think our initial proposal was to say, let's make it an OKR and have people think about it. That is not happening, at least as of now, but that's, I think, where we can go.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I think we didn't cover a lot in the agenda, but that's okay. I think there's a lot we can do async. And I think this conversation was very helpful as well. So I think in terms of next steps, I personally would like a link to what you just showed. But it sounds like if you, it is
agenda.
But if you all move forward, I think that the organization concept, like you said, can be parallel. And if you have a pod with a group, if you have a pod with a user who creates a group, that may just be an organization at some point anyway. So I think that that's okay. So, any other action items?
And just as a follow-on, like you said, Michelle, I agree that Christina and Gosha are the DRIs. So please, stay in sync asynchronously, and maybe also we can have some, as we progress, like we can have some more sync ups to kind of put our brains together to understand what's going on and how to not step on each other's toes.
I have no toes left, so
100%.
I will add one point to this discussion. Ultimately, as part of the pods, and very early, if we can do, we want to dog food pods for GitLab organization. So whatever solution we came up, it needs to also answer what we are doing in somehow backward compatible way, so we can migrate ourselves. And I think this is very essential design expectation, because GitLab organization, if we could move that, migrate that away, it's roughly like 40% of the capacity on gitlab.com right now. So
Camille, just hang on, let me have you clarify. GitLab as an organization and our 200 projects, or GitLab as an organization and all of our customers?
No, GitLab Inc., the presence of the GitLab Inc. on the gitlab.com installation. So GitLab org, GitLab.com, GitLab pages, a bunch of the groups. So I think like the intent is like, we need to have a solution that do pods and organization in a way that we can be like a very first dogfooding user of that solution, so we can migrate ourselves. So I think whatever you think about the organization, you have to think about through dogfooding by ourselves. So it has to be compatible with what we are doing.
And we have weirdness. right, in GitLab. That is, I think, something that other customers may have as well, right? We have different top-level namespaces and, you know, for
different
various
interactions, forking, open source,
Yeah.
like we need to have answer basically for ourselves. I think like if we don't have the answer with the policy and organization to our case, it's basically invalid architecture that we are pursuing.
But you said that Christina and myself will be the DRI. We also won't be able to answer all the questions. For example, forking, this is source code, and like we won't help with forking. Sorry. We definitely will help with, you know, with workspace organization, memberships, all the hierarchies that we can cover. There are also a lot of features that you mentioned that probably we won't be able to cover, so that would require cooperation with other teams.
That's understood. That's not a problem.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all. And like I said, we can continue this async, but this has been really helpful. And I know you've already met a ton with everybody all the time. So thank you very much for making time.
Yeah,
We're gonna be
thanks
meeting
for
more
it.
often.
It's a good one.
All right, bye-bye.